Good morning. Today is July 6th. And just for the record, for the summer, we're doing one today. And then the next recording will be on August 3rd. And then in September, we'll be getting back to twice a month. Hope you're all having an okay summer. So, I want to talk about a couple of things this morning, but before I do, I just would like to alert you to the fact that if, since the President of the United States referred to the socialists have been elected and the mayor of New York City as communists, that communism and socialism aren't the same thing. And you might want to look up the two definitions. And furthermore, most so-called communist countries of the days of yore are technically not communist countries anymore either. For example, Russia is not technically a communist country anymore, but maybe authoritarian, but it's not communist. And about the only communist country, or rather pure communist country in the world right now, is really North Korea. Anyway, so before we all swallow the idea that socialists are, by definition, communists, they are not. And to the best of my knowledge, neither the mayor nor any of the other people running for office are anything like communists, but they do say they're democratic socialists. Okay, so two topics today. I want to talk a little bit about climate and then about immigration. I think almost everybody, including the president, might have noticed that the weather is a little strange these days. 104 in various cities in Europe. 110, I think, in a couple of places in Indonesia. That, by the way, is not livable for humans. So the humans who couldn't get anywhere near cooling have actually had to die. Unless one thinks this is all serendipity, climate change is upon us, and even many climate deniers must recognize that something is happening that is different and that our climate seems to be changing, both in terms of heat wave and to some extent also unusual storms of different kinds, rains and off-season and so forth. Of course, climate scientists have been telling that to us for some time, but the politics of the United States has been denying climate change, right? And it's one thing to deny climate change. It's another thing to engage in things which actually makes climate change worse, whether you recognize it or not. Obviously, our American policy of urging coal-producing mines to get back into business and produce more coal is somewhat counterindicated to the idea that we need to do something about climate change. And in point of fact, many countries in the world are converting as rapidly as possible into ways that reduce their dependence on the production of coming from oil and coal and other things that produce harmful matters into the air. We don't, pay a lot of attention to what other countries are doing. There's been some news about the degree to which some of the small European countries are almost entirely now on wind and solar. And even countries like China, which are still heavily into coal and oil, are converting very rapidly, amazingly rapidly. More than 50%, or more than that in some areas of China, to solar and wind. And of course, China makes a major contribution to solar because they are still the largest producers of solar panels. So quite aside from our sort of deviant policies in the sense that our president denies that there's climate change. We are, of course, also doing things in terms of policy that go counter to mitigating the activities that produce climate change. Quite aside from this current policy of the United States, which, as I just said, was deviant from many other countries, both industrial and non-industrial countries, is the fact that climate research, which is an ongoing activity everywhere in the world to mitigate not only air temperatures and such, but also, for example, the warming of oceans, decimation of forests and growing capability everywhere. All of that requires research. And wouldn't you know it, we, the greatest country in the world with the highest scientific whatnot that our government proclaims, have closed and are closing all the various research institutions and labs that work on climate change. In other words, it's not only that we deny climate change, we deny the activities now which would produce better insight about what to do and how to cope with climate change. Quite obviously, it comes as a surprise to European countries that all of a sudden they have 104-degree temperatures. But countries like Indonesia and India, for example, have also suffered seriously with very high temperatures and also very high floodings. If you go to Jakarta nowadays, there are whole parts of the city where the water level has risen to the level that any normal street now has water. You sludge through water. And in some areas of Jakarta in the last few weeks, the water has been so high that it's not just, inconvenience to your shoes, it goes up to your ankles. So there is it's a serious awareness in large parts of the world, not only that climate change has already taken place, but anything that can possibly be done to mediate the activities and cease and desist from activities would make climate change worse. It's therefore both sad, ironic, and I suppose disturbing that we are not only, as we pride ourselves, the greatest, most industrial, et cetera, country in the world, but as a large country and as such a large economy, that we are not only not participating, but in many ways undermining the activities of others with regard to climate change. So we can't forget about climate change. It's not just enough to say, oh, well, it's very hot, or there's, hardly any sunshine in Santa Cruz most of June, etc., and blame it all on climate change. Some of it is climate change, some of it is seasonal, some of it is normal. But the denial on the part of the United States government is not just that a major country is denying it and therefore undercutting any progress in climate change, but also, has given up any kind of leadership and any kind of respect in this area. I mean, even, people who don't pay a lot of attention to the news, or for that matter, American politics, are dismayed when they hear that the President of the United States claims that climate change is a hoax when they're, in stifling heat and unexpected rain downpours, etc. So let me move on to immigration. Immigration is obviously an issue in the United States, but it's also an issue in most of the world. It's an issue in Europe, it's an issue in Japan, it's an issue in every imaginable place one can think of, and increasingly it will not only continue to be an issue, but it will become a greater issue. Because immigration issues are not just people needing to leave or wanting to leave for a better future, but also on the recipient side, more and more countries in the world will require immigration, temporary workers, but also immigration, because because of the lack of growth of their population. So if you are South Korea, if you are any country in Europe, if you are the United States, and indeed towards the end of the century, if you are in China, the fact that people are having fewer children and you don't have indigenous population growth, in fact, you have indigenous population decline, means that, and that with it, I'm sorry, I misspoke, and with that, of course, comes an aging population, so that you need workers, younger workers, to work your economies. Let's take a country like China, right, with a population of 1 billion, 0.3 or whatever, moving in the direction of only 1 billion people, and an aging population, and a population which is fairly homogeneous. I mean, there are ethnic groups in China and stuff, but they're, not importing Philippine labor or Australian labor or anything of the sort right now. But every indication is that even China will have to start importing younger labor sometime later in the century. And so the aging population in Europe, the aging population in many countries in the world, will require either guest workers or immigrants. And in most cases, people will not want to come unless they can immigrate, or they will stay long enough that it's a disadvantage for them not to have citizenship rights. So the idea of immigration is not a sort of temporary issue for the United States, which was a nation of immigrants everywhere, but is now a global issue. And for better or for worse, the very democratic, forward-looking, even Scandinavian countries are now on sort of anti-immigration binges. Now, why is this? It's not that they don't need most of these people. I mean, we certainly need our immigrant population. By the way, many of whom we're now kicking out of the country, right? Because they fill necessary jobs that are either not filled by nationals because they don't exist, or nationals don't want to fill them. So if you take the United States for a minute, you have a situation where many of the immigrants are working in old age homes, in hospitals, in all kinds of service industries. If they go away, you're not going to find mainstream Americans wanting those jobs. They're not pleasant jobs. They're not highly paid jobs. So they typically go to immigrants. Even immigrants, very often with good education and skills, start at the bottom, so to speak, and have to work themselves up the economic ladder in most countries, right? So whether we're the United States or whether we're Sweden or Denmark or Norway or whatever, all these countries have immigrants, need immigrants, and as this decade and the next decade move along, we'll need more of them because of not having enough indigenous workers as their own populations age, and having either no children or one child is not enough replacement, right, to provide the new supply of workers. Now, I've emphasized, workers that go in, immigrant workers that go into unskilled occupations, but that's also not quite true anymore. For example, in the United States, there is a very large layer existing, but also of need of, for example, physicians. We don't turn out enough American indigenous physicians. So many of the hospitals in the United States are staffed by Indian doctors, for example, right? Some of these have residencies and can stay. Others are getting kicked out. There are hospitals closing in Kansas, who, among other things, can't staff their own hospitals anymore. And the same thing is happening in other industrial countries. And in fact, in some late industrial countries, sometime in this century, they too will need immigrants from countries which still have a population surplus that is willing to move around. So, what used to be unusual for a country of immigration like the United States is having to become more usual for other countries, industrial countries in Europe and Japan, for example. You need workers, right? Where do they come from? They come from countries which has either a surplus of underemployed labor, might have people who want to leave for political reasons and so forth. So whether it's the United States or whether it's Japan or whether it's Norway, immigrant labor is now necessary at a very moment that countries which are fairly homogeneous say, well, what are these people? They don't speak our language. They look different than we do. They're undermining our, purity, whatever purity looks like. So here in the United States, we're now, or at least many of our fellow citizens are upset that, 50% of the population, more or less, is no longer of European origin. Well, that changes the country. And we're a nation of immigrants. Many countries in the world, like Japan and some European countries, are not countries of immigrants, right? And they're certainly much more homogeneous than this country has been for a long time. Now, from the perspective of the US, this sort of anti-immigration prejudice is now sort of tagged onto the fact, oh, these people are, not of European origin, and we don't want more brown people or black people coming to this country. Well, yes, it changes the population. But in the US, of course, we've had a more diverse population than some other countries. Again, Northern European countries, Japan, China now, very homogeneous. And people would just have to get adjusted to the fact that there is a mix-max of populations. And indeed, there's a racial mix-max, a religious mix-max, and so forth. That requires political leadership, which spells out both the necessity and the advantage of these shifting populations. And if you have a president like our current president, you are, and or right-wing parties in Europe, which are increasing in number and in power, whether it's France or even in England right now, you get the right-wing parties are anti-immigration, right? Let's be pure and let's try to stay pure. And that's a pipe dream. Now, we in the United States, of course, do very strange things. So, for example, in terms of legal immigration, our quota now for legal immigration is being given to white South African Afrikaners in order, as our racist policy, in order to enhance our white population. Well, first of all, there are not that many Afrikaners, but the Afrikaners are said to be facing death and destruction in South Africa. No such thing. There's no genocide, as President Trump suggests, of white South Africans, right? But we're letting those people in, but we're not letting in the spouses of Americans who've married, let's say, an Indian or a Pakistani or so forth very easily, and give them citizenship, because, of course, they're not enhancing our white population. Having pure white population in this racist sense is, as I said before, is a pipe dream. This is not what's going to happen in the rest of the century. People are going to move around, not just because they want to leave poor countries or authoritarian countries and move to better countries, but because their economic opportunities are elsewhere. And we, as the United States, are already in a position where you would say, roughly speaking, 50% of the population is not, quote unquote, pure white of European origin. That is an idea which is both unrealistic, is a dying idea. And so the question is, when does leadership, and in what countries does leadership welcome the diversity of the country rather than discriminate on the basis of race and ethnicity, as many countries have for some years, including Japan, for example. Japan didn't want non-Japanese coming into Japan and living in Japan or having citizenship in Japan. The consequence of the Second World War and the Korean War and so forth led a fair number of Koreans to move to Japan, and then their children were born in Japan. It took decades for the Japanese to allow those Koreans to become Japanese citizens because they were Korean. They were not Japanese. We're a pure society. So we're not the only country in the world that has these issues and that discriminates against people. But what's so stunning is that we, a country which has, argued for its diversity, has argued that it was a country like of immigrants, for example, the United States, Australia, and a few other countries, should now have a politics where a substantial number of Americans become, hostile to immigrants, decide, argue often in the political realm they're only hostile to illegal immigrants, which absolutely is untrue because, of course, ICE is arresting people who are perfectly legal based on what they look like. And discrimination on the part of a segment of the American public isn't even interested whether they're legal or illegal. They just don't want brown people, black people, yellow people from Asia to be infiltrating our country. So I guess what I would like to say here is that it is shocking and sad that we are currently pursuing the immigration policies that we are kicking people out right and left, whether legally or illegally, that we are, for example, avoiding the hospitality that we gave to people of, let's say, Haitian origin, and now want to deport Haitians into a situation which they left because of the horrors and the civil conflicts in Haiti, and now we're going to send them back to Haiti where the civil conflicts and the uproar and the gangs and the food situation is even worse than when they actually left. It is, by any standards of reasonable policy, of humane policy, and of self-interested policies, crazy. Our self-interest would be to continue to be a country hospitable to people and to recognize we need workers, both at the bottom and the top and the in-between. And as next decade, for example, we need more and more workers. And by the way, given the current politics, when all these people get ousted and sent back and set arrested, who are running nursing homes and all kinds of necessary jobs in the health field, when we're kicking them all out, who exactly is going to replace them? You might have already seen some newspaper articles about some nursing homes and elder care facilities having to shut down because their employees have been ousted from the country, even though they had legal permits to work here, in not all cases, but in some cases. So the politics of all of this is a nightmare, and the only thing one can say in some ways is this is not the first time, although it's on a larger and more major scale. American immigration policy has been iffy for a century and a half or more. There have been quotas. They have, keep the Japanese out, keep the Chinese out. And there have been prejudices against even immigrants who were not people, brown people or black people or Asian people. But for example, even in the 1950s in New York, there was real discrimination against people who were of Irish and Italian origin. Who wants all these Catholics from these two countries? And it was the discrimination in the early 50s in New York City was quite bad, to the point of which, as you moved a little bit further into the 50s, for example, the New York City Council would have one person of Italian origin and one person of Irish origin, citizens, but their origins came from there, to demonstrate that we were going to be more inclusive. So while nowadays the issue is around people of color from very different cultures, it wasn't that long ago that discrimination in the US was even for quote unquote white European people who came from the societies that we didn't want. They were Catholic, for example, and we didn't want more Catholics. So we have a bad history. But the history now, or the presence now, is really awful. And it's really awful that a country like the United States, rather than leading the world in tolerance and the willingness to integrate people into the society and to be hospitable and to allow people, who have jobs to stay and so forth. We are at the forefront, the role model immigrant country, right? And we are at the forefront of our really obnoxious policies right now, which make life, considerably worse, not just for the people who are getting chucked out or having to hide in their rooms, in their homes, and hope to escape deportation, but rather it's going to make life increasingly difficult for the very people who vote for our U.S. government, who want to oust these people and then find out that the services they were used to, that the people, as I said, in nursing homes, they're gardeners, they're this, they're that, are no longer available. In short, it's not only obnoxious that the U.S. is not being reasonable and hospitable to immigration, and the fact that we are increasingly a country, diversity is not just diversity from amongst Europeans and, of course, people of slave origins from Africa, but rather is a country of diversity racially, ethnically, culturally. And one of the good parts about the United States has always been that the second generation gets integrated, becomes Americanized, and undistinguishable in their behavior, their occupations, and so forth from Native Americans. That was always true. It is no longer true, because if you don't look the right way and you're walking the streets of God knows where, Minneapolis, somewhere else, you might very well, Chicago, Washington, D.C., you might very well become arrested and deported or imprisoned for long periods of time. It is a sad commentary on both the history and the present. And while other countries are similarly doing obnoxious things, we used to be at the forefront for preaching reasonableness and integration of populations. And we certainly have lost this calling. I think it's up for all of us to be well informed and to help our fellow citizens, protect them, lead reasonable lives, and welcome them, and recognize that racial purity, ethnic purity, national purity is a thing of the past. And the quicker we are open, hospitable, and welcoming to people both who we work with, who we encounter, but also who our children and grandchildren marry and have grandchildren with, the better off, not we in the United States, but everybody will be. And perhaps at some point we can return to being a role model as to how to do this properly. Thanks for listening. Talk to you in the next month.